Have you ever felt like your life was perfect? Like every piece of the puzzle fit seamlessly, creating a picture of success, happiness, and contentment? A life where your biggest worry is choosing between the penthouse in Monaco or the private island in the Bahamas? That was Alexander's life. He had it all. The empire he'd built from the ground up, a testament to his sharp mind and relentless drive. The sprawling mansion overlooking the city, a symbol of his hard-earned success. The tailored suits, the expensive watches, the effortless charm that made heads turn wherever he went. He was living the dream. Or so he thought. Alexander wasn't just successful, he was a force of nature. He commanded attention, not through arrogance, but through sheer presence. His gaze was steady, his handshake firm, and his words, when he chose to speak them, carried weight. He was a man who knew what he wanted and wasn't afraid to go after it. And he'd gotten it all. Except for one thing. Something he'd buried deep, something he'd convinced himself he'd forgotten. Something that was about to resurface and shatter his perfectly constructed world. His days were a whirlwind of board meetings, strategic planning, and high-stakes deals. He moved through his life with an almost preternatural calm, always in control, always one step ahead. His nights were filled with galas, charity events, and the company of influential people. He was a sought-after bachelor, the subject of gossip columns and whispered conversations. Women flocked to him, drawn to his power, his wealth, and his undeniable magnetism. But none of them touched him. None of them came close to breaching the wall he'd built around his heart. He'd learned early on that vulnerability was a weakness, a liability in the cutthroat world he inhabited. He'd seen what it could do to people, how it could leave them exposed and broken. So, he'd armored himself, becoming a master of control, a man who gave nothing of himself away. He was a fortress, impenetrable and unyielding. Or so he believed. Then, she walked back into his life. Not in a grand, dramatic entrance, but subtly, quietly, like a ghost from his past returning to haunt him. He saw her across a crowded room, a charity gala, ironically. The very air seemed to thicken, the music faded into a dull hum, and the noise of the chattering crowd became a distant echo. It was as if time itself had stopped, frozen in the moment he recognized her. Her hair was a shade lighter than he remembered, her eyes, those captivating emerald green eyes, held a depth he hadn't seen before. But it was her. There was no mistaking it. His past. His secret. His undoing that he hadn't seen her in years. Years he'd tried to erase from his memory, years he'd spent convincing himself she meant nothing. But seeing her now, standing there, so real, so vibrant, it was like a dam breaking. All the emotions he'd suppressed, the memories he'd buried, came flooding back, threatening to drown him. He felt a tremor run through him, a vulnerability he hadn't experienced in decades. He wanted to turn and run, to escape the tidal wave of emotions that threatened to engulf him. But he couldn't. He was rooted to the spot, his gaze locked on hers, as if an invisible thread connected them. She didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't even acknowledge him. She simply stood there, across the room, her presence radiating an aura of quiet strength and an unspoken sadness. And then, he saw him. A small boy, no more than 5 or 6 years old, standing beside her, holding her hand. The boy had her eyes. Those same captivating emerald green eyes, filled with an innocent curiosity that mirrored her own. And as Alexander looked at the boy, a cold dread washed over him. He knew. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone. The boy was his perfect life, the life he'd so carefully constructed, began to crumble around him. The walls he'd built around his heart began to crack, threatening to collapse entirely. The past he'd tried so desperately to bury had returned, not just in the form of a woman, but in the form of a child. His child. A child he never knew existed. A child who was a living, breathing reminder of a love he'd thought was long dead. The woman, her name was Anya. She had been a breath of fresh air in his structured, predictable life. He'd met her during a business trip abroad. She was different from the women he was used to. She wasn't impressed by his wealth or his power. She was intelligent, independent, and fiercely passionate about her work. She was an artist, a free spirit, who saw the world in a way he never had. She'd challenged him, pushed him, and made him feel things he'd never felt before. He'd fallen for her, hard and fast. It was a whirlwind romance, a passionate affair that consumed him completely, but their worlds were too different. His life was one of boardrooms and business deals, hers was one of art galleries and creative expression. He was a man of structure and control, she was a woman of spontaneity and freedom. He tried to fit her into his world, to mold her into the image of what he thought a successful man's partner should be. But she wouldn't be molded. She was her own person, and she refused to compromise her identity for him or anyone else. The relationship had ended as abruptly as it had begun. A misunderstanding, a clash of personalities, a failure to communicate. He'd been hurt, betrayed, and his pride had been wounded. He'd retreated into his shell, vowing never to be that vulnerable again. He'd buried his feelings for her, convinced himself that she was a mistake. A chapter in his life he wanted to forget. He'd moved on, or so he thought. Now, she was back. With his son. And everything had changed. The carefully crafted world he'd built was teetering on the edge of collapse. He didn't know what to do, how to react. He was caught between the man he was and the man he used to be, between the life he'd created and the life he could have had. He was a billionaire, a powerful man, a man who controlled his destiny. But now, he was faced with a situation he couldn't control. A situation that threatened to turn his perfect life upside down. He watched her as she interacted with the boy, her face softening with a tenderness he'd never seen before. He saw the love in her eyes, the protective instinct that radiated from her. And he knew, deep down, that he was in trouble. He knew that his past had come back to haunt him, not just in the form of a lost love, but in the form of a child. His child. And that child was about to change everything. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know what Anya wanted, what she expected from him. He only knew that his life would never be the same again. He took a deep breath, trying to regain control, to compose himself. He had to think, to plan, to strategize. He was a businessman, a problem solver. He would find a way to navigate this, to manage this situation, just like he'd managed every other challenge in his life. But as he looked at Anya and his son, a nagging doubt crept into his mind. This wasn't a business deal, this wasn't a strategic challenge. This was something personal, something emotional, something that went beyond the realm of logic and reason. This was about family, about love, about the past and the future. And for the first time in a long time, Alexander felt lost. He felt vulnerable. He felt afraid. He knew one thing for sure. His life was about to change. Dramatically. Irrevocably. He just didn't know how. He watched as Anya and his son turned to leave, the little boy looking up at her with adoration in his eyes. And as they walked away, Alexander felt a pang of longing, a yearning for something he'd never had, something he'd never allowed himself to have. A family. He had a son. A son he never knew. A son who was a part of him, a living embodiment of his past. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he couldn't walk away. He couldn't ignore them. He had to know. He had to be a part of his son's life. But how? How could he bridge the gap between the man he was and the man he needed to be? How could he reconcile his past with his present? How could he win back the love of a woman he'd lost years ago? And how could he become a father to a son? He watched them disappear into the crowd, the little boy's hand tucked securely in Anya's. He felt a pull, a magnetic force drawing him towards them. But he resisted. He needed time to think, to process, to understand what was happening. He couldn't just rush in, disrupt their lives, turn everything upside down. He needed a plan. He was a strategist, after all. He always had a plan that he excused himself from the gala, the polite conversations and forced smiles suddenly feeling suffocating. He needed to be alone, to clear his head, to make sense of the chaos that had erupted in his life. He drove back to his mansion, the sprawling estate feeling cold and empty, despite its grandeur. He walked through the silent rooms, the echoes of his footsteps amplifying the emptiness within him. He poured himself a drink, a single malt scotch, neat. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching the light catch its surface, the way it seemed to hold secrets within its depths. Just like him that he thought about Anya. He hadn't seen her in years, but the memory of her was still vivid, still sharp. He remembered her laugh, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. He remembered her passion, her fierce independence, her refusal to conform. He remembered the way she'd made him feel, the vulnerability she'd awakened within him. A vulnerability he'd quickly suppressed, burying it deep beneath layers of control and indifference that he'd met her in Florence, during a business trip. He was there to negotiate a deal with an Italian fashion house, she was there, working as a freelance art restorer. He'd been immediately drawn to her. She was a breath of fresh air, a stark contrast to the polished, predictable women he was used to. She was real, authentic, unapologetically herself. He'd pursued her relentlessly, captivated by her spirit, her intelligence, her beauty. They'd spent weeks together, exploring the city, sharing secrets, falling in love. Or at least, he'd thought she was the one. He'd even imagined a future with her, a life he'd never considered before. A life beyond boardrooms and business deals, a life filled with art, passion, and love. But their worlds were too different. He was a man of power and wealth, she was a woman of art and passion. He'd tried to mold her into his world, to fit her into the neat, structured life he'd created for himself. But she wouldn't be molded. She was a force of nature, wild and untamed. And he, in his arrogance, had tried to tame her. He'd given her an ultimatum, a choice between her freedom and him. He'd thought she'd choose him. He'd been so sure of himself, so confident in his power, his wealth, his ability to provide for her. He'd been wrong. She'd chosen her freedom. She'd walked away, leaving him hurt, humiliated, and confused. He'd never understood why she'd left. He'd never understood why she'd chosen her art over him. He'd never understood why she'd chosen freedom over security. He'd spent years trying to forget her, trying to convince himself that she meant nothing. He'd buried his feelings deep, convinced himself that he was better off without her. He'd moved on, or so he thought. But seeing her again, seeing his son, it was like opening a wound that had never fully healed. The pain, the hurt, the confusion, it all came flooding back, threatening to drown him. He thought about his son. He had a son. A son he never knew existed. A son who was a part of him, a living embodiment of his past. He wondered what he was like. Was he like him? Did he have his stubbornness, his drive, his ambition? Or was he like Anya, artistic, passionate, free-spirited? He longed to know him, to hold him, to be a part of his life. But how? How could he bridge the gap between them? How could he become a father to a son he'd never known? He knew he had to talk to Anya. He had to understand what had happened, why she'd kept his son from him. He had to know what she wanted, what she expected from him. He had to find a way to navigate this, to manage this situation, just like he'd managed every other challenge in his life. But this was different. This wasn't a business deal, this wasn't a strategic challenge. This was personal. This was emotional. This was about family. And for the first time in a long time, Alexander felt lost. He felt vulnerable. He felt afraid that he spent the next few days in a state of turmoil. He couldn't focus on his work, his mind constantly drifting back to Anya and his son. He tried to find out more about them, discreetly, of course. He didn't want Anya to know that he was investigating her. He learned that she was still working as an art restorer, that she was highly respected in her field. He learned that she was a devoted mother. That she loved her son fiercely. He learned that she'd never married. He wondered why. Had she never met anyone else? Or was she still holding on to something from the past? Something, or someone? He thought about contacting her, but he hesitated. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to approach her. He was afraid of her reaction. He was afraid of rejection. He was afraid of what she might want from him. He was afraid of losing her, again. But he knew he couldn't wait any longer. He had to talk to her. He had to know that he finally gathered his courage and called her. He'd managed to get her number from a mutual acquaintance, a discreet art dealer he'd met years ago. He'd almost hung up several times, his hand hovering over the call button. But he'd finally pressed it, his heart pounding in his chest. She answered on the third ring. Her voice was the same, soft and melodic, with a hint of steel beneath the surface. Hearing her voice after all these years sent a shiver down his spine. That he introduced himself, his voice steady, controlled. He didn't want her to know how much she affected him, how much he'd been thinking about her. She was silent for a moment, then she spoke, her voice cool, distant. She said she knew who he was. She said she'd been expecting his call. He was surprised. He'd thought she'd be angry, shocked, maybe even scared. But she was calm, almost detached. He asked if they could meet, if they could talk. She hesitated for a moment, then she agreed. She told him to meet her at a small cafe near her apartment, the following day. That he hung up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. He'd finally talked to her. He'd finally arranged to meet her. But he was no closer to understanding her, to understanding what she wanted. He was no closer to knowing his son. He was no closer to resolving the chaos that had erupted in his life. He was still lost, still vulnerable, still afraid. But he was determined. He was determined to find a way to navigate this, to manage this situation, to win back the love of a woman he'd lost years ago, and to become a father to a son he'd never known. He just didn't know how. He just didn't know what the future held. He only knew that his life was about to change, dramatically, irrevocably. And he had a feeling that the change was just beginning. The cafe was small and unassuming, tucked away on a quiet side street. It was a far cry from the opulent restaurants and exclusive clubs Alexander was accustomed to. But it was perfect for their meeting, Anya had said. Private, discreet, and away from prying eyes. He arrived early, his heart pounding in his chest. He chose a table in the corner, near the window, and ordered a coffee. He watched the door, his gaze fixed on it, waiting for her to arrive. He felt a nervous flutter in his stomach, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He was usually so calm, so composed, so in control. But now, he felt like a teenager again, waiting for his first date. That he thought about what he would say to her. He'd rehearsed it 1,000 times in his head, but the words still felt inadequate. How could he explain his actions, his past mistakes, his years of silence? How could he apologize for the hurt he'd caused her, the pain he'd inflicted? How could he ask her to forgive him, to give him a second chance? And how could he tell her that he knew about his son, that he wanted to be a part of his life? He saw her walking towards the cafe, her son holding her hand. His heart skipped a beat. He stood up, his legs feeling slightly shaky. She looked beautiful, even more beautiful than he remembered. Her hair was slightly shorter, but her eyes, those captivating emerald green eyes, were the same. They held a depth, a wisdom, a sadness that touched him deeply. His son was even more striking in person. He had Anya's eyes, but he also had his jawline, his strong, determined chin. He was a miniature version of him, a living, breathing reminder of their past. Anya and his son approached the table. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. He couldn't tell what she was thinking, what she was feeling. She introduced him to his son. "This is Alexander," she said, her voice neutral. "This is my son, Leo." Leo looked at him with curiosity, his emerald green eyes wide and innocent. He didn't smile, didn't say anything. He simply stared at him, as if trying to figure him out. Alexander extended his hand. "It's nice to meet you, Leo," he said, his voice slightly trembling. Leo hesitated for a moment, then he took his hand. His grip was surprisingly strong. Alexander felt a surge of emotion, a wave of love and longing. He wanted to hug him, to hold him close, to tell him how much he'd missed him. But he resisted. He didn't want to overwhelm him, to scare him. He wanted to take things slow, to build a relationship with him, to earn his trust. They sat down at the table. Anya ordered a tea, Leo asked for hot chocolate. Alexander ordered another coffee. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. He didn't know where to start, what to say. He looked at Anya, searching her eyes for a clue, a hint of what she was thinking. But her expression remained unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "Anya," he said, his voice low, I want to apologize." She raised an eyebrow. "For what?" she asked, her voice cool, almost challenging. "For everything," he said. "For the way I treated you, for the things I said, for the way I ended things. I was wrong. I was arrogant, selfish, and blind. I didn't appreciate you, I didn't understand you. I'm so sorry." She was silent for a moment, then she spoke. "Sorry doesn't change the past, Alexander," she said. "Sorry doesn't erase the hurt." "I know," he said. "But I hope that one day, you can forgive me." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "Forgiveness is a process, Alexander," she said. "It takes time. And it requires trust." "I understand," he said. "I'm willing to wait. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn your trust, to earn your forgiveness." He looked at Leo, who was sipping his hot chocolate, seemingly oblivious to their conversation. I know about Leo," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Anya's expression changed. Her cool, detached demeanor vanished, replaced by something harder, something colder. "Yes," she said. "You do." I want to be a part of his life," he said. "I want to be a father to him." She was silent for a moment, then she spoke, her voice flat, emotionless. "That's not possible," she said. His heart sank. "Why not?" he asked, his voice filled with despair. "Because," she said, "you gave up that right when you walked away from me. You gave up that right when you chose your world over me, over us. You gave up that right when you didn't believe in me, in us, in our future." "That's not true," he said. "I never gave up on you. I never stopped thinking about you. I loved you." She laughed, a bitter, humorless laugh. "Love?" she said. "You call that love? You abandoned me, Alexander. You left me alone, pregnant, with nothing. You didn't even know about Leo. You didn't even care." "That's not true," he said, his voice rising in desperation. "I would have cared. I would have been there for you. If I'd known. But you didn't know," she said. "And that's the point. You weren't there. You weren't there when I needed you the most. And now it's too late." "It's not too late," he said. "It's never too late. I can change. I can be a better man. I can be a father to Leo. Please, Anya. Give me a chance." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness, anger, and something else. Something he couldn't quite decipher. "I don't know, Alexander," she said. "I don't know if I can trust you. I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I can give you a second chance." She looked at Leo, who was now drawing on a napkin with a crayon. "He's my world, Alexander," she said. He's everything to me. I'll do anything to protect him. And I won't let anyone hurt him, not even you. I would never hurt him, he said, his voice filled with sincerity. I would never hurt either of you. She was silent for a moment, then she spoke. I need time, Alexander, she said. I need time to think. I need time to decide what's best for Leo. And for me. How much time? He asked, his voice filled with anxiety. I don't know, she said. I'll let you know. She stood up, taking Leo's hand. We have to go, she said. That he stood up too, his heart pounding in his chest. When will I see you again? He asked. I'll be in touch, she said, her voice cool, distant. She turned and walked away, Leo holding her hand. He watched them go, his heart sinking. He didn't know if he would ever see them again. He didn't know if Anya would ever forgive him. He didn't know if he would ever have a chance to be a father to his son. He was left standing there, alone, filled with regret, longing, and a deep, gnawing fear. He knew that his life had changed forever. He knew that he was at a crossroads. He knew that he had to fight for what he wanted, for what he believed in. He had to fight for Anya. He had to fight for Leo. He had to fight for his future. But he didn't know how. He just didn't know. And the uncertainty, the fear, the sheer weight of it all, threatened to crush him. He sat back down at the table, his mind reeling. Anya's words echoed in his ears, her cool, distant tone sending a chill down his spine. You gave up that right when you walked away, she'd said. Her words were like a dagger to his heart, twisting and turning, reminding him of his past mistakes, his past failures. He'd thought he was doing the right thing, giving her space, giving her the freedom she craved. But he'd been wrong. So wrong. And now, he was paying the price. That he finished his coffee, the bitter taste mirroring the bitterness in his soul. He needed to talk to someone he could trust, someone who could offer him advice. He thought of his closest friend, someone who had been with him through thick and thin, someone who knew him better than anyone else. He pulled out his phone and dialed his number. Hey, his friend answered. What's up? I need to talk to you, Alexander said, his voice strained. It's complicated. Okay, his friend said. What's going on? Alexander hesitated for a moment, then he poured out his heart, telling him about Anya, about Leo, about the meeting at the cafe. He told him about his past mistakes, his regrets, his longing to be a father to his son. He told him about Anya's words, her refusal to give him a chance. His friend listened patiently, offering words of comfort and support. This is tough, Alexander, he said. But you can't give up. You have to fight for what you want. You have to fight for your son. I know, Alexander said. But I don't know how. Anya, she's so different now. She's so cold, so distant. I don't know if she'll ever forgive me. She's hurt, Alexander, his friend said. She's been through a lot. You have to give her time. You have to show her that you've changed, that you're a different man now. I will, Alexander said. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll prove to her that I'm worthy of her trust, worthy of being a father to Leo. That's the spirit, his friend said. Just remember, be patient, be persistent, and be honest. Don't try to be someone you're not. Just be yourself. Thanks, Alexander said. I appreciate it. Anytime, his friend said. Just let me know if you need anything. Alexander hung up the phone, feeling slightly better, slightly more hopeful. He knew he had a long road ahead of him, but he was determined to walk it. He was determined to win back Anya's trust, to earn her forgiveness, to become a father to his son. That he spent the next few days trying to find ways to connect with Leo, to get closer to him. He knew he couldn't approach Anya directly, she'd made it clear that she needed time. So, he decided to try a different approach. He started by researching Leo's interests. He learned that he loved dinosaurs, that he was fascinated by ancient history, that he enjoyed drawing and painting. Armed with this information, Alexander started sending Leo small gifts. A dinosaur book, a set of paints, a model of a Roman chariot. He didn't sign the cards, he didn't want Anya to know that he was the one sending them. He just wanted to let Leo know that someone cared, that someone was thinking about him. That he also started frequenting the park near Anya's apartment. He'd sit on a bench, watching Leo play, watching Anya interact with him. He kept his distance, he didn't want to intrude, he just wanted to observe them, to learn more about them, to feel closer to them. One day, he saw Leo playing alone, near the swings. Anya was sitting on a bench, talking on her phone. Alexander hesitated for a moment, then he decided to approach him. He walked over to Leo, his heart pounding in his chest. "Hi," he said, his voice gentle. "My name is Alexander." Leo looked at him, his emerald green eyes curious. "Hi," he said. "I like your dinosaur shirt," Alexander said. Leo smiled, a shy, hesitant smile. "Thank you," he said. "I like dinosaurs." "Me too," Alexander said. "Do you have a favorite?" "The T-Rex," Leo said. "It's the biggest and the strongest." "That's a good choice," Alexander said. "But I like the Triceratops. It's got 3 horns." Leo giggled. "That's funny," he said. Alexander smiled. He'd made him laugh. It was a small victory, but it meant the world to him. They talked for a few minutes about dinosaurs, about Leo's favorite cartoons, about his school. Alexander didn't mention Anya, he didn't mention their past. He just wanted to get to know Leo, to build a connection with him. Just as they were talking, Anya finished her phone call and walked over to them. Her expression was guarded, wary. She looked at Alexander, her eyes filled with suspicion. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice cool. I was just talking to Leo," Alexander said, his voice slightly trembling. Anya looked at Leo, then back at Alexander. "It's time to go, Leo," she said, taking his hand. Leo looked at Alexander, then at his mother. He seemed confused, unsure. "But I was talking to Alexander," he said. "We have to go," Anya said, her voice firm. She pulled Leo away, leaving Alexander standing there, alone again. He watched them walk away, his heart sinking. He tried to connect with his son, but Anya had shut him down, just like she'd shut him down at the cafe. He felt a wave of despair wash over him. He didn't know if he would ever be able to break through her defenses, to earn her trust, to become a part of Leo's life. He turned to leave, his shoulders slumped, his spirit broken. But as he turned, he saw something that made his blood run cold. He saw a car speeding down the street, heading straight for Anya and Leo. They were crossing the street, they didn't see the car coming. Alexander's heart stopped. He knew he had to act, he had to do something. He couldn't let anything happen to them. He couldn't lose them. Not again. He ran towards them, as fast as he could, yelling at them to get out of the way. But they didn't hear him. The car was getting closer, closer, closer. Alexander knew he had only seconds. He had to make a choice. He could save himself, or he could save them. There was no time to think. He made his choice. He lunged forward, pushing Anya and Leo out of the way. The car slammed into him, throwing him into the air. He felt a sharp pain, then everything went black. He woke up to the sound of beeping. A constant, rhythmic beeping that filled the room. He opened his eyes, his vision blurry. He saw white. Everything was white. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, unresponsive. He felt a sharp pain in his side, a throbbing ache that radiated through his body. He was in a hospital bed. He remembered the car, Anya and Leo, the impact. He'd saved them. He'd pushed them out of the way. But what about them? Were they okay? He tried to sit up, but a nurse rushed to his side. "Don't move," she said gently. You've been in an accident. You're lucky to be alive. Anya, Leo, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Are they okay? The nurse smiled reassuringly. They're fine, she said. They're both fine. They were very lucky. You saved them. He closed his eyes, relief washing over him. They were okay. He'd saved them. He'd risked his life for them, and they were okay. That was all that mattered. He spent the next few days in the hospital, recovering from his injuries. He had a broken rib and a concussion, but he was alive. He was grateful to be alive. He thought about Anya and Leo. He wondered if they'd come to see him. He wondered if Anya had forgiven him. He wondered if he would ever have a chance to be a father to his son. One day, the nurse told him that he had a visitor. His heart pounded in his chest. He wondered if it was Anya. He waited anxiously, his gaze fixed on the door. And then, she walked in. Anya. She looked at him, her eyes filled with emotion. Relief, gratitude, and something else. Something he couldn't quite name. Thank you, she said, her voice soft. You saved our lives. You risked everything for us. You're welcome, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I would do anything for you, for Leo. She walked over to his bed and sat down. She took his hand, her touch sending a shiver through him. I know, she said. I know you would. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. Anya, he said, I want to talk about the future. About us. About Leo. She nodded. I know, she said. Me too. They talked for hours. They talked about their past, their mistakes, their regrets. They talked about their future, their hopes, their dreams. Anya told him that she'd realized how much she still loved him, how much she missed him. She told him that she'd been afraid to let him back into her life, afraid of being hurt again. But she'd seen his true character, his selfless act of bravery, and she knew that he'd changed. He was a different man now. She also told him something that he hadn't expected. She told him that Leo wasn't just his son. He was also his brother. Alexander stared at her, his mind reeling. What? He asked, his voice filled with confusion. Anya explained that years ago, after they'd broken up, she'd discovered she was pregnant. She'd been alone, scared, and unsure of what to do. She'd decided to keep the baby, but she'd also made a difficult decision. She'd decided to use a sperm donor to conceive a second child, a sibling for Leo. She'd wanted him to have a brother, someone to grow up with, someone to share his life with. And she'd chosen Alexander. She'd used his sperm, frozen from when they were together, because she wanted Leo to have a connection to his father, even if he never knew him. She'd never told Alexander because she was afraid of his reaction, afraid of what he might think. Alexander was stunned. He didn't know what to say. He had a son, and that son was also his brother. It was a bizarre, complicated situation, but somehow, it made sense. It explained the connection he'd felt to Leo, the feeling that he knew him, even though they just met. That he looked at Anya, his eyes filled with love and gratitude. Thank you, he said. Thank you for giving me this chance. Thank you for giving me Leo. Thank you for giving me my brother. Anya smiled, tears streaming down her face. I love you, Alexander, she said. I always have. I love you too, he said. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you, to Leo, to my brother. They held each other close, finally reunited, finally ready to start their new life together. A life filled with love, family, and a bond that was stronger than anything they'd ever imagined. A life that had been turned upside down, but in the end, had become perfect in its own way. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions. Alexander, still recovering from his injuries, focused all his energy on building a relationship with Leo. He spent hours with him, playing games, reading stories, and simply talking. He discovered that Leo was a bright, curious, and sensitive boy, with a passion for art and a deep love for his mother. He also learned about the challenges Anya had faced raising Leo on her own, the sacrifices she'd made, and the strength she'd shown. His respect for her grew with each passing day that he also had to come to terms with the revelation about Leo being his brother. It was a strange, almost surreal situation, but he embraced it. He realized that blood wasn't the only thing that made a family. Love, trust, and commitment were just as important, if not more so. He vowed to love and protect Leo, not just as his son, but as his brother. Anya, seeing Alexander's genuine love for Leo and his commitment to their family, began to let go of her past hurts and fears. She started to trust him, to open her heart to him again. She saw the man he had become, the man who had risked his life for her and Leo, the man who was now a loving and devoted father and brother. She fell in love with him all over again, but this time, it was a deeper, more mature love, built on respect, understanding, and forgiveness. Alexander, Anya, and Leo began to build their life together. They moved into a new house, a place where they could create new memories, a place where they could be a family. They decorated Leo's room with dinosaur posters and art supplies. They created a family album filled with photos of their adventures together. They celebrated birthdays, holidays, and small everyday moments. They laughed, they cried, they shared secrets, they became a family. Alexander also focused on his career, but his priorities had shifted. He still worked hard, but he no longer defined himself by his wealth or his power. He realized that the most important things in life were family, love, and happiness. He used his resources to help others, to make a difference in the world. He supported charities that helped children, he funded art programs for underprivileged communities, and he became a mentor to young entrepreneurs. That he also made amends with his past. He reached out to people he'd hurt, apologized for his mistakes, and tried to make amends. He learned that forgiveness was a two-way street, that it required humility and a willingness to change. Life wasn't perfect, of course. They had their challenges, their disagreements, their ups and downs. But they faced them together, as a family. They learned to communicate, to compromise, to support each other. They learned that love wasn't just a feeling, it was a choice, a commitment, a daily act of kindness and understanding. Years passed. Leo grew into a talented young artist, with a passion for painting and sculpting. He was kind, compassionate, and fiercely loyal to his family. He was also very close to Alexander, their bond strengthened by both fatherhood and brotherhood. They shared a special connection, a deep understanding that went beyond words. Anya and Alexander's love deepened over time. They were partners, best friends, and soulmates. They supported each other's dreams, they celebrated each other's successes, and they comforted each other's sorrows. They built a life together, a life filled with love, laughter, and family. One evening, as the sun was setting, Alexander, Anya, and Leo were sitting on the porch of their house, enjoying the cool evening breeze. They were talking, laughing, sharing stories. Alexander looked at them, his heart filled with love and gratitude. He had everything he'd ever wanted. He had a family, he had love, he had happiness. He had a life that was far more fulfilling than anything he could have imagined. That he thought about his past, the man he used to be, the life he used to live. He'd been so focused on success, on power, on wealth, that he'd almost lost everything that truly mattered. He'd learned that true success wasn't measured by money or status, but by the love you shared, the connections you made, and the difference you made in the world. He'd also learned about forgiveness, about second chances, about the power of love to heal and transform. He'd learned that family wasn't always defined by blood, but by love, loyalty, and commitment. He'd learned that life was precious, that every moment should be cherished, that every relationship should be nurtured. He looked at Anya and Leo, his heart overflowing with love. He'd been given a second chance, a chance to build a family, a chance to love, a chance to be happy. And he was grateful. He was grateful for everything. He took Anya's hand, she squeezed it gently. He looked at Leo, who was sketching in his notebook, his brow furrowed in concentration. He smiled. His life was perfect. Not in the way he'd once thought perfect meant. It was real. It was messy. It was complicated. But it was perfect. Because it was his. He knew that life would continue to throw challenges their way. But he also knew that they would face them together, as a family. They would face them with love, with courage, with hope. Because that's what families do. They support each other, they love each other, they never give up on each other. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Alexander felt a sense of peace, a sense of contentment. He had found his happy ending. He had found his family. He had found love. And that was all that mattered. He had learned that the greatest riches in life are not material possessions, but the love and connection you share with the people you care about. And he had finally found his treasure. His family. His love. His life. It was a life turned upside down, but ultimately, a life made whole. And he wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. The billionaire's past love had returned, not to destroy his life, but to complete it. To make it what it was always meant to be. A story of love, loss, redemption, and ultimately, a family bound by something far stronger than blood, an unbreakable, unconditional love.